In our first session, we discussed the emotional blow of the destruction of the temple, how it was felt by the people at the time, how it was expressed later on in literary works. The earliest one that we have, the book of Baruch, or the Syriac book of Baruch, which was written maybe around the year 100, that is to say, just a few decades after the destruction itself. And we asked ourselves, well, not only what was the nature of the blow, but how it was addressed, what attempts were made to alleviate the pain that was felt by the destruction, by this terrible blow of the destruction of the temple. Today we're going to take this a step further and ask ourselves how the people of that day understood the destruction, understood the impact, the ultimate impact that this destruction would have on their lives, on their daily lives, and certainly on their religious lives and behavior. And again, we're going to begin with that same apocryphal book of Baruch because it's the earliest work that we have in our possession that really alludes to the destruction and describes an event that appears in a number of other works of the first centuries of the Common Era. The author describes or turns to the priests of the temple just prior to the destruction, as the destruction is about to take place. And he says as follows, "You priests, take the keys of the sanctuary, cast them to the highest heaven, give them to the Lord, and say," I'm adding God, "guard your house yourself, because behold, we have been found to be false stewards." This description appears in a whole slew of other parallel sources, Midrash, and in one case in Talmud as well. The idea being that the priests are about to hand the keys of the sanctuary back to God. They can no longer be responsible for watching over the temple, for watching over temple service, and so on. And so here, take the keys and have them back. Here's another version of that same story. Two Amoraim, that is to say, two rabbis of the rabbinic period, of the Talmudic period, argue. One says that he, and I'll explain who he is in a moment, threw them and they have yet to come down. The he refers to the first temple period and to King Yehoiachin. And the source here in the Talmud in Yerushalmi and in some parallel sources claims that when the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar approached the land of Israel, the Sanhedrin got word of this and were, of course, frightened. What is he about to do? Is he about to destroy the temple? And so the Sanhedrin goes out to meet King Nebuchadnezzar and ask him, "Are you about to destroy the temple?" And he says, "No. Just give me that one fellow that I crowned at some earlier date," and the reference is to Yehoiachin. "Just give him to me and I'm out of here." But Yehoiachin somehow either refuses or can't find his way to Nebuchadnezzar. And in the end, the two Amoraim, years later, of course, say that he, the king, threw them, the keys, up into the air, and they have yet to come down. And the other says he saw the image of a hand take them from his hand. Now we can discuss this statement in a number of ways. If the king threw the keys of the temple up in the air and they have yet to come down, is that a good sign or a bad sign? Does it mean that God has taken the keys and they are not to come down again? In which case, we've lost it? We've lost access to the temple forever? Or could it mean that temple worship is in abeyance? In other words, God is taking a pause here and maybe trying a rewind, as it were, to a new temple era. The other rabbi says that he, the king, saw the image of a hand take them from his hand. In other words, here you actually have a more fleshed out description where God takes these keys to himself and we don't know what he does with them. Leviticus Rabbah, another midrash from the rabbinic period, we're talking now already 4th, 5th century, two Amoraim, one said the shape of a hand of fire. That seems to be an allusion to some either deity or God himself. The hand of fire took them the keys from the king's hand. The other Amorah says, from the time he threw them, they have yet to come down. This seems to allude to the fact that everything is still up, well, I hate to use the phrase up in the air, in abeyance. In other words, we don't really know, will there be a restoration of the temple? Will there not be one? The keys have been taken from us, and they are now in God's hand. Here we have the version in the Babylonian Talmud. Our rabbis have taught, when the first temple was about to be destroyed, bands upon bands of young priests with the keys of the temple in their hands assembled and mounted the roof of the temple and exclaimed. Now remember, this all, according to the Talmud, all of this apparently refers to the first temple, even though it is clear beyond any doubt that the impact of the second destruction is what influenced these texts. And so the priests took the keys of the temple in their hands, mounted the roof of the temple and exclaimed, Master of the universe, as we did not have the merit to be faithful treasurers, these keys are handed back into thy keeping. Then they threw the keys up towards heaven. So this is pretty close to what we've seen, but there's an additional fact here. And there emerged the figure of a hand and received the keys from them. And now comes the addition, whereupon they jumped and fell into the fire. This idea of a mass suicide of the priests is in addition to the earlier sources that we saw, but it does appear already, or some similar suicide appears in the writings of Josephus and in other works. In other words, what we have is a cluster of sources that all talk about some sort of a mystical event in which the temple was now again removed from Jewish control. It was taken over by God or by some other force. And this, of course, introduces us to one of the main questions that we will address today. What happened to the relationship between the people of Israel and God with the destruction of the temple? Without a temple, has access to God simply been lost? Because we all assumed that it was through the temple, through temple worship, through sacrificial worship, that the people of Israel had access, ongoing access to God by supplying the Lord with all of those requisite sacrifices that are enumerated in the Bible. Without a temple, has the conduit between the people of Israel and God, has that conduit been destroyed? Have the links been severed? How do we get in touch with God without a temple? This is the question that apparently arose almost immediately. Not only that, but we hear that there was some sort of criticism as we get into the post-temple period, and particularly when we get into the later centuries, 3rd, 4th, 5th centuries, we begin to encounter criticism on the part of the rabbis of the priestly leadership of the temple. In other words, something went wrong with this temple. Not only were we not good guardians, but something went wrong with the relationship between priests and temple worship, and maybe the deity. And we find one of the rabbis giving forth with this dirge, with this weeping and wailing over who is in control of the temple. Now this, of course, still relates to the temple before it was destroyed. Woe is me because of the house of Boethus. The text here is going to list a number of priestly families that control the priesthood and by extension the temple. Woe is me of the house of Boethus. Woe is me because of their staves. Woe is me because of the house of Hanin. Woe is me because of their whisperings. In other words, you get the sense of this misbehavior. They have staves, they whisper, clearly whispering derogatory things about whoever's in control. Woe is me because of the house of Cathros. Woe is me because of their pens. In other words, they're writing against various people. Woe is me because of the house of Ishmael, the son of Phiabi. Woe is me because of their fists. For now comes the ultimate claim. For they are high priests. Their sons are temple treasurers. Their sons-in-law are trustees. Their servants beat the people with staves. The leadership of the temple, the high priesthood, and the priests who are in control of the temple have gone astray. They've lost any connection to proper maintenance of the temple. They are, in fact, now there only because of pedigree, because they come from prominent families. By the way, you may notice that these names are not quite Hebrew names, Kathros, Fabi, and so on. These were families of priests that were brought to the land of Israel by Herod years before to make up for his own removing of Hasmonean priesthood by decimating that priesthood. And he had to fill the ranks by bringing in priests from abroad. And so we have these Greek-sounding names or Egyptian-sounding names as the priesthood. But what we have is rabbinic criticism of the priestly leadership of the temple. Here we have a source that tells us that it was indeed this issue of pedigree that may have been one of the causes for the misbehavior of the priests. There was an incident, and this is from the Babylonian Talmud, much later. There was an incident involving a high priest who exited the temple. Everyone followed him, in other words, an entourage following the high priest as he leaves the temple. When the crowd, however, saw two sages on the other, I assume on the other side of the street, when they saw Shemaiah and Avtalion, they left him, the high priest, by himself and followed Shemaiah and Avtalion. In other words, the source seems to be saying that the crowd has it right. They respect the proper people, the sages, Shemaiah, Avtalion, who were the teachers of Hillel and Shammai, by the way. Eventually, however, Shemaiah and Avtalion came to take leave of the high priest. Let's be honest, they are Jews who have to respect the high priest as well, however he might be misbehaving. The high priest sees these two sages approach, and he said to them, "Let the descendants of the nations come in peace." This was a rub. This was a not so masked derogatory reference to the sages, because Shemaiah and Avtalion were known to be converts, not to have been originally Jewish. And here you have the priesthood, which of course is based on pedigree, saying, "Welcome, you people of the nations," meaning, again, this is a total put down. They said to him, "Let the descendants of the nations come in peace," meaning us, who perform the acts of Aaron. Let not a descendant of Aaron come in peace who does not perform the acts of Aaron. Here you have one of the very, very direct criticism of what happened to the priesthood. It became a pedigree-oriented leadership, not behaving in the manner expected of a high priest or of the priesthood in general, and better the people who behave like Aaron than the descendant of Aaron, right? We will come in peace, but the descendant of Aaron who does not perform the acts of Aaron, of course, cannot be acceptable. So what we have here, and there are many more sources like this, I just chose a few, that reflect a high criticism of the priesthood, of what happened with the priesthood, and by extension, the temple itself, as we get towards the end of the Second Temple period. But now we have another source that I wanted to dwell on. Babylonian Talmud, Tractate Brachot, brings an enigmatic statement, and I brought the Hebrew because the word here in Hebrew is critical. I'll read it in Hebrew and then we'll read the translation, or the two possible translations. Amar Rabbi Elazar, this is a rabbi of the 3rd century who came from Babylonia to the land of Israel, Elazar ben Pedat. Miyom shecharav Beit HaMikdash, now come the difficult words. Nifseka chomat barzel bein Yisrael le'avim shebashamayim. And I have to translate this sentence with the problematic word being nifseka. And here we have two translations. This is the conventional translation. Rabbi Elazar said, from the time the temple was destroyed, an iron wall cut Israel off, nifseka chomat barzel, from its Father in heaven. In other words, here is one approach that claims that from the day the temple was destroyed, right, our connection with God, our ongoing access to God has been severed. There is an iron wall that separates us from our Father in heaven. So clearly the destruction here is deemed, of course, as a negative factor, as a negative development, right? Our access to God no longer exists. But there's another way of translating that very same sentence. And Rabbi Elazar said, from the time the temple was destroyed, the iron wall that was between Israel and its Father in heaven came to an end. Nifseka in Hebrew, right, and in Rabbinic Hebrew, can very often mean it ended. And so one can almost understand this as meaning that the destruction of the temple, strange as it may sound, may have been a positive factor. That temple was a barrier between God and the people of Israel for whatever reason, maybe because of the priests that we saw just a few moments ago. And I brought a few examples very quickly of uses of the word pasak. In Rabbinic Hebrew, it can mean separate, but it can also mean to end. When the first temple was destroyed, the monarchy of the house of David ceased, the Urim Betumim were canceled, and the law of Levite cities, Levitic cities, the Levites were given special cities because they were not given an ongoing income as were other priests and others. And so we're told that the law of field cities given to the Levites, pasku. And here's the word pasak means ended. So if the root pasak here means to end, cease, then maybe the destruction, the removal of the temple caused a removal of the barrier between Israel and its God in heaven. But here, I have one or two other examples. I think I'm going to skip them and simply give you a sense of what we found there. What we find is nifseka chomat barzel, when the temple was destroyed, an iron barrier, nifseka, ended, or an iron barrier separated God from the people of Israel. And so you have two radically different interpretations of the very same sentence, meaning, and clearly this must have been on the minds of people with the destruction. What has happened to our relationship with God, our ongoing access to God without a temple? The assumption being, God told us that we relate to Him, we have access to Him through sacrificial worship. Sacrificial worship is in abeyance, it has ceased to exist, and as such, we no longer have access. That would have been one approach. And yet the other approach sounds radical to us, but could very well be a possible interpretation, and that is the temple was a barrier. The temple itself was an iron wall. And we've seen those priests who misbehaved and ran the temple. And so it could be that some rabbis believed actually that the removal of the temple may have served a positive development. I say this because as we continue, we're going to see that the sages come up with all sorts of alternative modes of access to God. And all of this seems to suggest that the rabbis could somehow accept the lack of a temple, and they could accept the lack of sacrificial worship and not consider those factors to be the ultimate barrier between Israel and God. In other words, the rabbis will give us alternative manners for connecting with God, for serving God, for worshiping God. And all these alternatives ultimately are going to become the path of Judaism in a post-temple period. And so here we have the introduction, and this is the first element that I'll talk about today. In our next session, we'll talk about other means of access to God. But here we find the introduction of prayer as the equivalent to sacrifice and good deeds. And so we read again, by the same Rabbi Elazar who claimed that with the destruction of the temple, the barrier has either been removed or separates Israel from God. The same Rabbi Elazar, however, does stress that there are alternative paths for accessing God. Prayer is greater than good deeds. And Rabbi Elazar said prayer is greater than all the sacrifices. So here you have that same Rabbi Elazar who talked about the temple as being a barrier, now telling us that in fact prayer is better than everything that was lost with the destruction with sacrifices. Prayer is greater than all the sacrifices. And he quotes Isaiah, as it is said, "What need have I of all your sacrifices?" In other words, God actually dismisses the ultimate need for sacrifices as a way of accessing God's goodwill or corresponding or somehow with the deity. So here you have Isaiah being used as a proof text that all is not lost with the temple because prayer is greater than sacrifice. And it is written, here you see that the people pray even when sacrifices were no longer accepted. When you lift up your hands, I will turn my eyes away from you. Though this, of course, is after I have no need for sacrifice, God seems to be saying, yes, I know that if sacrifices are not acceptable, you're going to then lift up your hands. You're going to start to pray. I won't accept that either. But the process here seems to be sacrifice comes first, but even more potent are lifting up your hands, prayer. But here too, if your hands are stained with blood, prayer won't help either. And in fact, we have statements connected to Elazar's former statement that seem to suggest the same thing, that prayer may have advantages that are not to be found even in sacrificial worship. Rabbi Chanin said, some say Rabbi Chanina said, whosoever prolongs his prayer does not return unanswered. In other words, we are going to encounter statements that stress the potency of prayer being greater than sacrificial worship. And one can only ask, and statements like this, were they used to console? In other words, people are distraught. There's no temple. There's no altar. We cannot offer sacrifices. And to address that pain and that terrific religious blow, the rabbis seem to say, well, if you pray and you prolong your prayer, it will not go unanswered. And our question has to be, are these just consoling statements? Is this consolation, or is this a new theology? Is this a new ideology? And what it seems to be is that there will be a critical mass of statements of consolation. Don't worry, you can get along even without a sacrifice, even without a temple and an altar, because we have A, B, and C. Those statements, which recur, nevertheless mount up. And ultimately, from, as I say, consolation, seem to be a new theology of God's relationship with the people of Israel. And we have a number of other examples that go in that direction. Here we have one of the Midrashim. When Moses saw with the Holy Spirit that the temple is destined to be destroyed and the first fruits are destined to cease, he immediately ordained that Israel pray 3 times every day. In other words, prayer takes the place, right, of temple worship. That they pray 3 times a day. And now comes the ultimate statement, which raises the question, because prayer is dearer to God than all the good deeds and all the sacrifices. That's the ultimate statement of, as I say, a statement that began as consolation. We can continue to survive as Jews even without a temple because we can pray. And prayer is superior, right, than all the good deeds than offering up sacrifices. There's a way out. And here we come to I think the critical question, so where did that leave the people of Israel? And here we come to an interesting question. Where did Israel learn how to pray? If prayer is something relatively new, that only appears when sacrificial worship is in abeyance, right? Where did they learn how to pray? Who taught them how to pray? And here I like to quote one particular story. It's a story about who was the first one to pray in the Bible, or who was the first biblical figure to pray in any sort of biblical context. And of course, the answer is God himself is the first to pray. And here the rabbis quote one of the sources, one of the scriptures in Psalms 76:3. His tabernacle was in Shalem, right? Shalem is, of course, or can be Yerushalem as well, Jerusalem. God's tabernacle was in Shalem, his abode in Zion. And the rabbis explain this scripture as follows. At the beginning of the creation, God erected a tabernacle in Jerusalem as if to pray in it. In other words, God is the first to actually pray. Nobody preceded him. And he does this in Jerusalem. He erected a tabernacle. Sukkah is the word in the text. He erected a tabernacle in Jerusalem as if to pray in it. And what did he pray? And now comes the content of the prayer. And of course, the big question is, who does God pray to? What does he say? Be it my will. I mean, if it's your will, then do it. In other words, not only how does God pray, but to whom does he pray? And what does he pray for? If he's all powerful, why need prayer? Just do whatever the deity wishes to do. At the beginning of creation of the world, God erected a tabernacle in Jerusalem as if to pray. And what is his prayer? May it be, now I can't say thy will because God is praying to himself. May it be the will that my sons perform my wishes, so that I do not destroy my house and my sanctuary. So here again, the first prayer that we have, as it were, or the earliest text of a prayer written by God himself, relates to the destruction of the temple and the sanctuary. In other words, God himself tries to prevent the destruction by praying in Jerusalem, in a tabernacle, that he not destroy the house, meaning the temple, and the sanctuary. And now, this is accompanied by an interesting story. Because the question is, okay, God prayed, was God's prayer accepted? And by whom was it either accepted or not accepted? What happened to that prayer that God made not to destroy the temple? It has been taught. Rabbi Yossi says, I was once traveling on the road, and I entered into one of the ruins of Jerusalem in order to pray. So he's in Jerusalem, and this is destroyed. This is, of course, post-temple period. I entered one of the ruins of Jerusalem in order to pray. And Elijah of blessed memory appeared and waited for me at the door till I finished my prayer. After I finished my prayer, he said to me, and there's a discussion between Elijah and Rabbi Yossi. Did he endanger himself, Rabbi Yossi, by going into that ruin? Who knows what he could find there? But then Elijah asks Rabbi Yossi. He said to me, my son, what sound did you hear in this room? And Rabbi Yossi answers, I replied, I heard a divine voice cooing like a dove, saying, woe to the children on account of whose sins I destroyed my house, burnt my temple, exiled them among the nations of the world. This is fascinating. God's prayer was not accepted by God himself. In other words, if at first, right, in that earlier source, we saw that he prayed that the people behave and thereby I need not destroy the temple, now we have God testifying to the fact that because of the sins of Israel, God, had to destroy my house, burn my temple, and exile them to the nations of the world. And so the message is, we can pray, but our prayers are not always accepted. And we learn this from God himself. The original one to pray in Jerusalem had a prayer that was not accepted, and the temple was therefore destroyed. And so here we have different approaches to the destruction of the temple, and this idea being that maybe ties with God have indeed been severed. How are we going to access him? So yes, we saw prayer was one possibility. But in our next session, we're going to find that the rabbis came up with a whole slew of possibilities. And one of them will ultimately change the path of Jewish history in subsequent generations, because the ultimate path will be Torah Judaism, which is not prayer. It's a completely different direction, which I will explain in our next meeting.